Hey everybody, and welcome back to Thursday's Theology. This is the last week on prayer, and I promise, because I know I've said that about 4 or 5 times in the past, but I am for real this time. This is the last episode on prayer. Last week, whoop, didn't want to fall off there. Um, Last week we talked about what it looks like to be angry with God through our prayers, and I think that that's a really important aspect of prayer because oftentimes we can see being angry with God as something that is, I don't know, against the rules, or just we have kind of um, this weird relationship when it comes to anger with God. If you want to check out last week's episode, the link to that is down below. Now, like I said, this is going to be the last. Oh, can't jump up there. This is going to be the last week on prayer, and I wanted to think about what I told you guys a few episodes ago, and that is sometimes God answers your prayers in the ways that you need them answered, and not necessarily in the ways that you want them answered. And there you go. Um, and what I realized is that I didn't really qualify that. I didn't really talk about, yeah, got him. I didn't really talk about an example of what I meant, or I didn't make it clear. That being said, I wanted to share your story with all of you about a time in my life where I realized that God was answering my prayers in the way that I needed them answered, and not necessarily in the ways that I wanted them answered. Gosh, first of all, let me make sure I survive this. Um, so, as I said in my introduction, I am a pastor in the Santa Barbara area, and I grew up in Oakland, California, and yeah, if you would have told me 5 years ago that I would be a pastor at a local church in Santa Barbara, California, I would have told you that you were smoking, because I, at that point in my life, had no idea that I was going to be a pastor. I had no idea that I was going to go into ministry full time. Um, and it was definitely a way of God answering my prayers in the way that I needed them answered at the time, and not anyway in the way that I wanted them answered. Now let me back up a little bit. I've shared with you all before that I am a historian by trade. I went to UC Berkeley, got my undergrad at I got my undergrad in U.S. history, and once I got into history, I realized that I really liked studying it. I really liked being part of academic conversation, and just areas of history that I was really passionate about, especially when it came to U.S. history. That being said, I knew that I wanted to be a college professor in history. That is what I wanted to do. That was what my focus was. That was what my passion was about. Oh gosh, grenade. Um, yeah, okay, get this guy out of here. Okay, good. Yeah, I wanted to be a historian. I wanted to write books. I wanted to teach lectures. That's what my main goal was. And I applied to grad school. I went to San Francisco State, got my master's in history, and I felt pretty good about myself. I felt I was pretty smart. I felt that I was ready to take my education to the next level. So I decided to go ahead and apply for PhD programs. Now, thing about PhD programs is that they are extremely, extremely hard to get into. Um, I'll give you an example. My top school that I wanted to go to, and I can't believe I'm saying this because I'm a UC Berkeley grad, was Stanford. I really, really wanted to go to Stanford just because they had an excellent history program and everything. That being said, Stanford, out of 350 applicants that they get to their history PhD program every year, there's only about three that are accepted. So it is an insane acceptance rate for Stanford. Now, what happened was that I applied to not only Stanford, but a few different schools. I think I ended up applying to about 7 or 8 schools in total. And it turns out I was rejected from every single one of them. And at that point, I thought to myself, like, oh, maybe I'm not actually as good at history as I thought. um, so I had a lot of trouble with just rejection and just feeling inadequate and feeling like I'm not good enough and, all that good stuff. But what ended up happening was it really caused me to go on this era of discernment. Now, for those of you who don't know what that word is, discernment is basically a period of just kind of questioning what you're going through. It's a period of reflection. It's a period of just really asking yourself tough questions and what that means, and what you're going to be doing with your life, and all the existential questions that one goes through at some point in their young adult experience. So what ended up happening with me is that I had all these questions of what it meant to be called to ministry. And the reason being is because all throughout undergrad and graduate school, I had been working at a church, a couple different churches actually. One was the church that I grew up at, and then in grad school, I worked at a church not too far away, maybe about 5-10 minutes down the road. So I worked in various capacities in youth ministry, youth intern, youth director, so on and so forth. And I actually really enjoyed the job. And at that point, I didn't think that it was going to be anything important because, I was on my way to be a history professor. So this youth ministry job was just something to hold me over until I got accepted into a PhD program. And that was all I thought of it. So what ended up happening was I was working, at these churches, and I was doing my youth ministry thing and working my way towards a PhD in history. But when the PhD in history ended up not working out, all of a sudden it called into question everything that I had been preparing myself for. I didn't know what I was going to be doing. Oh, look, nice. Sweet ring. I didn't know what I was going to be doing. I didn't know where God was in all of this, because clearly God had not answered my prayers about going to Stanford for history. So I was kind of lost. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was going on, where I was supposed to be, all those existential questions that were coming into my head. So what ended up happening was I was working as a youth intern, like I said, and what happened was I was just wrestling with what it meant to be called. Now, I'm going to probably do a couple episodes on what it means to be called in general, just because I think that that's an important thing to really talk about. But what I want you to know about it is that whenever I heard a pastor's story of how they were called to ministry, I always heard these fantastic stories about, how the heavens parted and God's voice came out from the cloud and said, you're going to be a pastor. That is what you're supposed to do. So I expected that a pastoral call, that's what it looked like. So when it didn't happen to me, all of a sudden it didn't make much sense, because I didn't have that really, really awesome point in my life where God called me into ministry. I'm going to run back here for a second. Oh gosh, no. Go down, Drake. So I never really had that moment of blinding light or that burning bush that really solidified my call to ministry. And it really bothered me, because to me, that's how you tell that you're called to pastoral ministry, is you have that moment. So what ended up happening was I just went on this prolonged period of just questioning my call. And there was a moment in all of that where I had the opportunity to go to a conference that my denomination puts on. So I'm part of the Evangelical Covenant denomination, and we have a conference every year called Midwinter. Now, Midwinter is a gathering and there's guys there. Midwinter is a gathering of about 150, 200 pastors, and what it is it's a time of refreshing for a lot of pastors. They go there, they get seminars, they get training, that sort of thing. I had this opportunity to go to this seminar, to this conference called Midwinter, and I felt so out of my league, because when I got there, there were so many. Oh, there's clearly somebody there. Oh gosh, awkward. There were so many pastors there that were so stoked about their call to ministry. They had these incredible call stories of of everything that had God had said to them and everything that God had spoken to them, and it was just really encouraging to hear. But at the same time, it was discouraging because none of that happened to me. Um, so I didn't think I was called. So going to this conference, I felt really out of my league because there were all these pastors that had incredible call stories. So I really prayed about it. I was at the point of saying, you know what, God, if this is your will, please make it known to me, because it is frustrating me to no end, um, to to not know whether or not you are calling me to this or not. So what ended up happening was I went to the conference, and I was there and, overwhelmed and didn't know what to do with myself. And then the second or third day that I was there, I met a guy named Chuck. Now, this guy named Chuck, I kid you not, that's his name. I had never met before. He was a pastor from the Sacramento area. I never knew him. I never knew his ministry context, anything. But what ended up happening was that, let me get rid of this guy and then duck behind the wall again. What happened with Chuck is that he looked me dead in the eye about 2-3 minutes into our conversation, and he told me to my face, "You realize you're called to pastoral ministry, right?" And that was it. That was my call moment. He looked me in the eye. It was the Holy Spirit moving through him, and all of a sudden everything clicked for me. So coming back from Midwinter 2 years ago, it it suddenly dawned on me that God had been preparing me for this role even before I even knew that He was going to call me to this role. And what I mean by that is that all of the youth ministry experience that I had been gaining throughout undergrad and grad, all of a sudden it wasn't just because I kind of enjoyed it, or that it was something that was, paying the bills or whatever, but it was something that God was using to train me to assume a pastoral role. I had no idea that God was preparing me to do that. And I think when I prayed to God to make it clear to me what He wanted, I had no expectation that He would call me into pastoral ministry. I was hoping for for God to say, something along the lines of, I know that you're disappointed that you didn't get into PhD programs, but, there's something better out there for you. And, in a roundabout way, it is true. There is something out there that's better for me. It was coming back from that conference, all of a sudden, all of my gifts, all of my talents, all of my, oh yeah, that's the way it's supposed to go. Everything that I was good at, everything that I was passionate about, all of a sudden made more sense because I figured out that I had been called into pastoral ministry. So my study in history was, I'll tell you another time about how do I phrase this? So basically, coming back from Midwinter, I was really kind of angry with God because I told God, like, why didn't you call me 2 years earlier? And I could have avoided grad school in history altogether. I could have just gone straight to seminary, and I could have just skipped it altogether. But thankfully, God has been very gracious with me and patient, and has revealed that I needed to go to grad school for history before I started seminary, for a number of different reasons. And I'll save that story for another time. But the point is that God really spoke to me and used that time that I studied history for a good purpose. So just know that. So anyway, what I had been praying for had been this hope that God had a PhD program in history available for me. And in light of being called into ministry, all of a sudden, that's not what it is anymore. It's, up, and there, whoa. No, he could have survived that. He's survived worse. So coming back from Midwinter, I realized that my gifts and talents made more sense to me. And I can't really explain how or why, but oh, there's the ledge. But it's just this feeling, overwhelming feeling I get that I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing, and it's an incredible feeling. It's frustrating. It's exhilarating. It's all of the above. But that is a way that God really answered my prayers in a way that I didn't even know that I needed. Um, but in the way that I needed them answered, God showed up and God answered them in that way. Okay, there we go. And I'm gonna jump. Oh, that's cool. Except, okay, okay. Um, okay. Sorry, guys. I'm trying to remember how to get around this. Right, because that makes sense. No, come on. That was stupid. That was stupid. So yeah, everything made sense in light of my call. My gifts, my talents, my abilities, everything. So God really, really answered my prayers in a way that I didn't even know I needed, but exactly what the way that I needed them answered. And I can't really explain it any more than that, because that's truthfully what it was. It was a divine experience of realizing that God had a larger plan for me than I even had ever realized. So, okay, I'm gonna try to be careful this time. Oh, what do you do? I hate how sensitive this game is. But anyway, yeah, that's kind of my story. And being called to Santa Barbara, even if itself, I'll have to tell you guys that story another time too, because we're running out of time for this week's episode. But basically, I had applied to a lot of different churches, wasn't getting any feedback, wasn't getting any leads, and this church in Santa Barbara was the last church that I chose to apply to before suspending the search, because I was spending way too much time hoping and discerning and trying to figure out what I was going to do next, that I really wasn't focusing at the... What the heck? No. You know what? I'm just going to end it here because I'm kind of frustrated with this level. But anyway, I had applied to a bunch of churches, and long story short, Santa Barbara was just kind of a fluke church that I heard had an opening, and I just submitted my application, and all of a sudden, 3 months later, I was being called to join the staff as their pastor of student ministries. And again, Santa Barbara is not a place that I had ever envisioned serving. It was not a place I had ever envisioned being called to serve in, but here I am. And my call story, for me at least, is proof that God answers prayers in a way that we need them answered, and not necessarily the way that I wanted them answered. I'm very close to my family. I didn't want to leave them. I wanted to work at a church close to home, and that's what I wanted. But where I'm at right now, I realize that I need this place in ways that I couldn't even have fathomed before moving here. So yeah, all that to say, God answers prayers. And that's kind of where we're going to end this series on prayer. I hope that you've found it at least a little bit helpful, just hearing my story and some thoughts that I've had on prayer. Next week, we're going to start a series called What's That? And the reason why I wanted to go into this series is that I think there's a lot of words and phrases that are thrown around church that we don't really know what they mean. There's, for instance, sanctification, grace, salvation. What are those things? So we're going to take the next few episodes to explore this idea of what's that. So what's the first one? Oh, I don't remember. Well, tune in next week to find out what the first episode of the What's That series will be. And we're going to close this week's episode with our favorite segment, and that is the Obscure Bible Verse of the Week. And what I want to remind you of is the fact that there's no context given to these stories, just because if you read the Bible out of context, it doesn't make sense. So this week's Obscure Bible Verse of the Week is brought to you by Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 21. And it says, "Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk." And that is this week's Obscure Bible Verse of the Week. So remember, if you like what we're doing here, if you like what you're hearing, or if you disagree with it, that's okay. Let us know in the comment section below. We want to try and start a conversation with you and figure out what it is we can be answering, what it is we can be talking about, etc., etc. So, yeah, if you like what we're doing, go ahead and subscribe to our channel and turn on those little bells that you can know when we upload a new video. Videos go live about 11 a.m. every Thursday, so we look forward to seeing you next week for next week's installment and the new series, What's That? And remember, theology doesn't have to be complicated. It is simply the study of who God is.